Okay, so we're going to talk about invasive species. We talked about those keystone species, those foundational species, both of which had a huge impact on the survival of a community. If those things were absent from the community would suffer. So we're going to talk about invasive species. Invasive meaning coming into an area or kind of taking over, and in a lot of cases causing harm in a community. I know something I referenced in class a lot of the time was the invasive species of Asian carp in the Illinois River, and we talked about how there were videos of people driving boats down the river and hundreds of fish just jumping up all over the place. So we're going to talk about what those look like and what effect they have on the communities. Introduction. Take a look at the photo below. Just another pretty morning drive in the hills of Tennessee. But wait a minute. Those trees, they're covered with something. Look closer, and you'll see that almost the entire landscape is covered with a thick green blanket. This blanket is made up of an invasive plant called kudzu. So as you guys can see in the picture, you have all those trees and bushes and the land covered by that like thick mossy grass. Kudzu is one dramatic example of what can happen when a species gets introduced into a new ecosystem when it has abundant resources and few predators. So when a species has tons of resources, they're able to thrive. And then on the other half, they don't have anything trying to eat them or kill them. They're going to thrive and thrive and thrive and thrive and take over. The kudzu plant was introduced to the United States from Asia in the late 1800s as an ornamental plant. And it was planted widely in the South in the 1900s to reduce soil erosion. What the people who planted this vine did not know was that it would rapidly take over the landscape, growing as much as a foot a day and enshrouding shrubs, trees, and even houses and old cars in a suffocating girdle of vines. So this plant would completely take over. If you think about plant growing a foot a day, so think about how tall you guys are, 4 feet, 5 feet, and this plant is growing to the size of you in 4 or 5 days. How crazy is that? Invasive species like kudzu are vivid and scary, an example of how ecological changes, including those caused by humans, can alter communities and ecosystems. In this article, we'll look into more detail about what an invasive species is and how invasive species can disrupt ecosystems, often reducing the numbers of native species and altering the overall structure of the community. So what is an invasive species? An invasive species is a species that has been introduced to an area outside of its native range and has the potential to cause harm, or has already caused harm in its new location. Many invasive species are found in the United States, and a few examples are shown in the pictures below. So take a look at the pictures below and see if you have seen any of these. The purple loosestrife, zebra mussels. I've seen a bunch of zebra mussels. I don't know if those of you who have gone to California before have seen zebra mussels. They're usually attached to piers and just gather in the dozens on the piers, on the rocks. They're all over the place. The common buckthorn is another one. Garlic mustard, emerald ash borer, and the European starling. So here's our case study for today. It's talking about the Asian carp, which we already discussed in class, so you guys should be pretty familiar with this. This case study is going to talk about what happened when Asian carp were introduced to the Illinois and Mississippi rivers. So let's take a look what's arguably the kudzu of the aquatic world, the Asian carp. Since they were introduced in the United States in the 1970s, Asian carp have rocketed in numbers thanks to their vast appetite and speedy reproduction. Now they form up to 95% of the biomass in some Mississippi and Illinois River. So these guys are everywhere in some areas of these rivers. Not only that, these fish have led to an international lawsuit about waterway access between the United States and Canada. This is a dramatic example of what can happen when an invasive species gets a foothold in a new place. So where did the story begin? Asian carp, which are not a single species, but a group of related species, so there's lots of different type of Asian carp, they were introduced to the United States in the 1970s. They were imported largely by fisheries and sewage treatment plants, which use the carp's filter feeding abilities to rid ponds of excess plankton. So this was a disruption, a human disruption, a forced human disruption of us altering forcefully an ecosystem. So we wanted to get rid of plankton, so we brought in a bunch of fish that had amazing ability to filter these ponds and these waterways. Because they are big eaters and fast reproducers, Asian carp can often outcompete native fish species with whom they share habitats and food sources. Black carp eat mussels and snails, limiting their ability for native fish and damaging shellfish population. Another Asian carp species, the silver carp, eats plankton, a key food for many native fish species in their larval and juvenile stages. So these Asian carp are just getting at all this other food that all these other species rely on, which is in turn decreasing other aquatic animal populations or animals that rely on mussels and snails and plankton to survive. Although Asian carp can be eaten, the fish are really bony and they generally are not desired as food. We talked about this in our classroom. There's just too many bones in them to enjoy. Also, if you go out fishing for a fishing trip, be careful. You could get smacked by an Asian carp. The fish, frightened by the sound of approaching motorboats, often thrust themselves into the air and may land on the boat or directly hit boaters. There's a fantastic picture of the carp jumping up below. When I was near the Illinois River kayaking, I could actually smack my paddle on the water and all these fish would jump up in the air. That's how many of them are living right under the surface. The Great Lakes and their prize salmon and lake trout fisheries are also threatened by Asian carp. These invasive species have already colonized rivers and canals that lead into Lake Michigan, including the major supply waterway linking the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River. To keep the carp from leaving this canal, electric barriers have been used to discourage migration. However, the threat is serious enough that several states in Canada have sued to have the Chicago Channel permanently cut off from Lake Michigan. We don't know whether the Asian carp will prove to be mostly a nuisance, like invasive species such as the zebra mussel, or whether it will ultimately destroy the largest freshwater fishery in the world. The story of the Asian carp shows how population and community ecology, fisheries management, and politics can intersect, and how ecology can have a very real importance for human food supply and the U.S. economy. On a more personal note, it also shows how ecology can matter for folks enjoying a day on the river, who might happen to get smacked with a flying carp.